All right, welcome to the Pro Football Hall of Fame. My name is Jake Wright. I'm the Youth and Education Manager here at the Pro Football Hall of Fame, and we're excited to bring you another live educational program featuring a very special guest today on our Facebook page as part of our offerings every Friday here at noon. So we'll jump into our program here a little bit, but first I want to talk a little bit about the Hall of Fame. Our mission at the Pro Football Hall of Fame is to honor the heroes of the game, to preserve its history, to promote its values, and to celebrate excellence everywhere. And those values we speak on are those of commitment, integrity, courage, respect, and excellence, all of which play a huge role, not only in today's football game, but as you'll learn in all of society, especially the military. And we'll get into the relationship between, the United States military and all the events in our country, as well as how it ties into the history of football. As we know, tomorrow is July 4th, Independence Day, a day our country comes together to celebrate the birth of our nation and the signing of the Declaration of Independence. 244 years ago, a collection of individuals signed a document freeing us from England and starting out our own independent country. The game of football is something like celebrating July 4th that brings our country together. And as we'll see today, the game itself and the military have many ties throughout its history. So to celebrate the game and Independence Day, we are happy to welcome Mr. Joe Horrigan here with us again today. Joe is known as the foremost historian in the game of football and who has worked here at the Hall of Fame for over 40 years and will help dive into this topic today. So, Joe, before we get into our topic today, can you just give everybody a quick background, how you ended up here at the Hall of Fame, what you did, how your career spun into what it is today?
Wow, 42 years, summarize it in how long?
Very short.
All right. Well, in 1977, I came down here, and I was originally hired as a curator here at the Hall of Fame, and just in a number of years, kind of did just about every job here. But when I got here, I was the 9th full-time employee at that time, and we're now over, 60 probably. So things have changed a lot. I progressed through the ranks, became a vice president, executive vice president, and eventually the executive director of the Hall of Fame, from which that position is when I retired about a year and a half ago now. And it was a long but rewarding career because, as you say in the mission statement, it is something that you can be very proud of what you do here at the Hall of Fame, what you represent to the youth of America in particular, but everybody. There's something here for everyone. And I think that the mission kind of defines what we do, but this place is more than just a museum. It's an inspiration. And I think visitors come away with something more than they expected every time they visit here.
Absolutely. And before we dive into the topic, before we get into the whole relationship between the military and the game itself, you actually served our country. So without getting into too much detail, what was that experience like for you? And looking back, is this something that you would do over again?
Sure. Yeah. Well, I spent 4 years in the Air Force, 1970 to 1974, and it was during the Vietnam War, but I did not serve in Vietnam. I was one of the fortunate ones that stayed stateside for 4 years, which is a terrific opportunity. But I'll tell you this, that, when I went into the service, I went in as a young man. I interrupted my college years to spend the 4 years in the military. But when you go in kind of with your eyes wide open, but you are surprised by what you eventually, realize what is going on. You do a lot of growing up. You meet a lot of people that you would not have otherwise mixed with. Particularly in the 60s and 70s, there was a lot of tumultuous things happening in the United States. And if you're hidden in your own one little cocoon, you didn't experience life outside your communities. And the world is much smaller than it was back then. So by going into the service, you met a lot of people from a lot of different places, a lot of different beliefs, a lot of different philosophies, every race, creed, and color. And that was a great experience. And to me, it's an experience that I'll never forget. And I learned so much from those 4 years of just being with different people.
And we'll dive into that. I'm glad you brought that up because we're going to dive into something very similar to that here shortly. But first, the NFL was founded September 17th, 1920. You got the famous painting right here of Ralph Hayes' Hupmobile showroom. The NFL founded right here in Canton, Ohio. And this was right at a time around where World War I was ending. So how did the athletes who served during that time kind of help get the game started?
Yeah, it was interesting because, just like today, when 1920, when the league was founded, they were coming off a pandemic. There was what was known as the Spanish flu back then, and it was very, very devastating. But it was also at the same time in World War I, in 1917. So in 1918, the pandemic hit. So they interrupted what little pro football was being played, but major colleges interrupted their schedules as well during the pandemic because they were concerned about large crowds. They were wearing masks just like we're doing today. So it's very similar in those regards. But you also had servicemen returning from the battlefield. When they were coming back, either go back to college, start their college careers, or maybe go right back to pro football, they were different. There was a big change in their life, obviously, having had this, war experience. But there was also a lot of change in the country. Guys coming back from the, into the rural South, something called the tractor had been incorporated into agriculture, which took a lot of jobs. So there was, guys coming back to find out that they didn't have the jobs they expected to return to. Same way with some of the industrial cities and places around the country that were built up during the war effort. Well, those jobs went away as part of the return to normalcy from following the war. So there was a lot of tumultuous things happening at that period of time. So sport kind of became that thing that brought a little normalcy back. And that was a really important thing for communities, small and large, whether it was a college campus or a small city like Canton, Ohio, or Akron, Ohio, where pro football was blossoming.
So we move on from World War I to about 20 years later to when World War II was happening. And the NFL was already an established league, not only in America, but starting to expand even further than that. The Japanese bombed Pearl Harbor in 1941. And NFL games were actually being played, as that event went on. So what was the NFL's response to World War II, and what steps were taken as the United States was entering into the war?
Yeah, well, it was very different times again, and at that point, the NFL was really just beginning to, get a really good footing in some major cities. They were moving from the small town America to major cities. So it was impacted greatly again. But the commissioner, Elmer Layden, had really took charge, and he was a great inspirational college football star and coach, and he was the athletic director at Notre Dame. Elmer Layden, along with the owners, really embraced what can we do, to keep the sense of normalcy, and at the same time be respectful of what's going on. They lost a lot of NFL players to the service, either drafted or enlisted. So much so the teams like Pittsburgh and Philadelphia had to merge for a season. And then Pittsburgh and the Chicago Cardinals the next season merged. Boston and Brooklyn merged just to have enough players to fill out rosters. And so there was a lot of, economics that were being impacted by that. But they really felt that they wanted to keep the games going so that there was still some normalcy happening back in the homeland. And at the same time, the players that were playing, were still very good players. Many of them were, not draft eligible because of their marital status or had 4F or whatever it might be. They still were able to play good quality football. And at the same time, the NFL took a social conscience to the whole thing and said, look, we have to do something aside from, this is no time to worry about making a profit. So they had exhibition games, and all the proceeds went to war relief efforts. They had U.S. bond sales, which was to raise money for the war effort. At halftime, a lot of the athletes would sell them. The Green Bay Packers had one where it was the largest sporting sport league or team to raise money. With the most amount was from the Green Bay Packers at one night in Milwaukee. So they did things like that. And then while they're playing football on the weekends, these guys all had jobs during the week working in war-related industries. So it was a situation where it wasn't just about sports. It was about how can sports elevate the collective patriotism of the country and at the same time provide that sense of normalcy.
So you mentioned a lot of the NFL lost players because they had to go fight for their country. And we'll get to the Hall of Famers here in a second. But, there's obviously stories that go around the league of guys who lost their life, fighting for our country. And there was one famous player who used to play for the New York Giants. His name was Al Bellos. Can you talk a little bit about him?
Al Bellos was a kind of typical of the, when we talk about America's greatest generation. Al could have taken a deferment just because of his mere size. He was tall, he was very tall. He could have been deferred just based upon his size, but he chose not to. And he enlisted after having, I believe he was able to participate in 7 games with the Giants before enlisting. And he was coming out of Georgetown where he held indoor and outdoor shot put records, U.S. shot put records. Then in basic training with his Army unit, he set a world record for the hand grenade throw. I don't know who was measuring it because I wouldn't want to be on the receiving end of measuring that. But he was obviously a great athlete and had great potential to be a real star in the NFL. And the Giants were very excited about having kind of stolen this guy. And I think it was the 6th round where they drafted him. But they were very hopeful that he would return. And unfortunately, just weeks after he enlisted, he was in an attack where he lost his life. But not just Bellos. I mean, the Giants also had another game named Jack Loomis in the end with the Giants, who I think he may have played 3 games. But Jack and Maurice Britt, who played with the Detroit Lions, and Joe Foss, who went on to become the American Football League commissioner. Those 3 men received the military's highest honor. They were all recipients of the Congressional Medal of Honor for above and beyond the call of duty.
So not only do we have those everyday players that, that weren't lucky enough to make it to the Hall of Fame, but did just as much, if not more, for the country. There were some Hall of Famers, and one of those Hall of Famers is Chuck Bednarik. And we'll go here 1 second to a little bit more on him. But when you think of Chuck Bednarik, the Hall of Famer, what comes to mind? Is it his service, or is it, what he did on the field?
Well, I think of both, because Chuck was not only a great star on the field, but he was an actual hero as he served as gunner during World War II. But he was somewhat a son of immigrant parents. He represented everything that America really was, its melting pot. And, and Chuck was this I don't know how to describe him, and I knew him very well. He was just a guy that really totally committed himself to whatever it was he believed in, whether it was football, his country, which he loved dearly, his ethnicity, which he was very proud of, and his city of Philadelphia. So Chuck was just one of those guys that was totally committed to everything he did.
Concrete Charlie, right?
That's absolutely
all right. Now we're going to go out to our museum to Nathan Martin, who's a youth and edge coordinator here at the Pro Football Hall of Fame. He's going to talk a little bit about Chuck Bednarik's career on the field. Nathan, you there?
Thanks, Jake. And as you guys can see, I'm live here in the Hall of Fame gallery, surrounded by these bronze busts. Literally surrounded. But we want to let you guys know how special it is and what it means to actually have one of these bronze busts. In the history of pro football, or football in general, there have been 300 million people to play at any level: pee-wee, high school, college, pro. Only 5 million people have played the game of football at the college level. Of that 5 million, only 29,000 have played, coached, or administered the game at the professional level. And here in Canton, we have 326 bronze busts. Chuck Bednarik being one of them, right here. Concrete Charlie. No National Football League player in the 1950s was immune to bone-jarring contact with the Philadelphia Eagles' Chuck Bednarik, because the 233-pounder played on both the offensive and defensive units long after the two-way player had largely faded from the scene. Chuck was selected first overall in 1949 as the Eagles' bonus draft choice and earned a starter spot as a center on offense and a linebacker on defense. As an offensive center, Big Chuck was a bulldozing blocker, but on rushing and passing plays, both. On defense, he was a true scientist in his field and the kind of tackler who could literally stop even the finest enemy runners, quote, on a dime. His athletic abilities and inspirational play were particularly evident in 1960 when injuries forced the Eagles to ask their 12-year veteran to again play both sides of the line. The 35-year-old was sensational. He finished the campaign with a 58-minute performance capped by a game-saving tackle in the Eagles' NFL championship victory over Green Bay. With just seconds remaining, the Packers' Jim Taylor appeared to be heading for a game-winning touchdown until the last Eagle in his path, Bednarik, bear-hugged him to the ground as time ran out. As you guys can see, Chuck Bednarik is well-deserving of a bronze bust here in Canton. Jake, Joe, back to you.
And we get to World War II, and this is something you mentioned before. 1 year after the war ended and football started to become what it was again, the game reintegrated with the signing of 4 African-American football players. You can see them up here: Marion Motley, Bill Willis, Kenny Washington, and Woody Strode. Do you think the fact that men of all colors fought together on the battlefield in the war led to the fact that these 4 players were signed by the Browns and the Rams, respectively?
Well, it's an interesting story, because it was still a segregated military, and there was great heroism demonstrated by the African-American units that did fight for this country. And then to come back to this country and still feel or believe that there was a second-class citizenship that went along with being an African-American in this country, it was a great thing that these 4 pioneers were able to demonstrate that they could play football not only at a high level, but be right there and compete with their white teammates and get along. Now, that is not to say it was a perfect world for them in pro football. It wasn't, but it was the start. It kicked the door open. And when we say it, it's often said that they reintegrated the league, which they did, and ended the segregation. Well, it didn't end it. it began the transition of ending it. I like telling a story about Marion Motley, who I got to know very well. He's from Canton, Ohio. Marion actually told me once, I asked him, I said, when you were playing, when you first started in the NFL, it was the All-America Football Conference he started with. I said, was there a lot of tension between white and black players, he being the only one? And he said, no, he said, my teammates treated me really well. He said, now some of the opponents weren't so accommodating. And he said they used to do as he would call it a little extracurricular activity after the play was over. He showed me his hands. He had scarred hands from where players would drive their cleats into his hands and so on. He said, but I do remember, he said, I remember the game official who first threw a penalty for unsportsmanlike conduct for that type of behavior. And I said, really, you remember the official? And he said, yeah, I remember his name. And then he started to tell me, he kind of went blank a little bit. He says, oh, gosh, I forgot it now. And he's a little guy from Buffalo, New York. And I said, Tommy Hewitt? He goes, yeah, that's his name. I knew the name because I'm from Buffalo, New York, and everybody knew Tommy Hewitt was a game official, and then he's always in the game programs. He says, he's the first official that threw a penalty flag for unsportsmanlike conduct. And he says, and that was the beginning of with the game officials, that they said, basically, we're not going to tolerate this type of behavior. So there were all sorts of things that were changing. But yeah, as they came out of the military, these four players coming out of college and coming out of the military, integrating or reintegrating the NFL was a big step.
All right, Nathan back out. This is the great thing about not being live, that we can just pause and then we go back in. All right, let me know when you're good to go.
Yeah, we're good.
All right. Let me take a pause. Mm-hmm. So there are many examples. We've just talked about those in World War I and World War II, and I'm sure there are other examples, as we get through. We don't have time to get through all those, so I want to jump up to some more recent ones, sure. And that being September 11th. As we all know, most of us were around for that. I know it's in history books now, which makes me feel old. But again, the NFL had a part, in this tragic day. At the time, Paul Tagliabue, who's a member of our class of 2020, who make sure you tune in. He'll be enshrined in 2021. Make sure you come to Canton and see that. He was the commissioner of the NFL at the time. What decisions did he have to make, and what did he have to go through to make sure that, life kind of, kept moving on, but they still respected the events that had happened?
Yeah, it's a really, really interesting story, what transpired from the moment New York was attacked. Now, remember, the National Football League's offices are right in New York City. And Gene Upshaw, who was the director of the Players Association, Paul's counterpart with the players, was in D.C., dropping his children off at school when the Pentagon was hit. So these two men right away contacted each other. They were adversaries in terms of negotiations, but they were friends. And they called each other to check on, make sure that everybody was okay. And at that point, Paul didn't really know about the status of all of his employees. Later, he found that two of his employees were indeed affected by family members. But what Paul faced all of a sudden was he had to make these very, very important decisions, whether the games were to be played the following weekend, which, seems, I don't know, when you think about it today, what an interesting or maybe even easy decision it might be, because he made the right one. But he could have gone the other way, because there was a lot of pressure under on Paul to cancel, to play the games, rather. He canceled them. To say, again, I used that word before about normalcy. We're not going to let these terrorists think that they beat us or whatever. We're coming right back like nothing happened. We're going to play those games. But he said, no, this is not the time for that. This is the time to take a deep breath, pause, mourn for the loss, and think about the future. So they paused the games and put them off for the week, let everybody kind of gather themselves, really understand what happened. But the emotion that Paul was tied up in, and I've talked to him about it, it was a lot of pressure. But he walked home from his office the night afterwards, and he just said, I knew then I couldn't do this. We can't play games after this. This is football. This isn't an essential element of our existence. So they did cancel, but when they came back the following week, they came back with purpose. They had John Bon Jovi singing "America the Beautiful" out of one of the firehouses that was piped into all the stadiums that day. They had all sorts of pregame celebrations involving the military and thanking the military and the first responders for their tremendous acts of heroism. And everybody in the stands, signs that used to say defense now said support our troops, things like that. It elevated the collective patriotism in a way that no other private sector could have possibly have done it. Stadiums were filled with red, white, and blue, and fans passing firemen boots through the stands to collect money for the families of those that were lost. So it was all sorts of things that I think that with the bully pulpit that Paul Tagliabue had, he used it beautifully to help us feel good about ourselves again, and at the same time pay respect to those that we lost, and as I say, raise that collective level of patriotism that was needed.
Like everybody was on the same team that day.
No question about it.
It didn't matter what team you were cheering for on the field. Everybody kind of had that collective feeling. And so would you say football played a pivotal role in kind of getting back to that normal life?
There's no question about it, Jake. In fact, that first game that was played was the Kansas City Chiefs and the New York Giants. And the Giants were playing in Kansas City. Now, we all know the strike was in New York City. When the Giants players came out on the field, they came to a roaring standing ovation. Not that it was the New York Giants, but it was representative of New York, which was representing the country at that point in time. And that was how the game went, the whole game. It was a competitive game again once they were playing on the field. But it was all about understanding that we're all in this together. We're on the same team.
Mm-hmm. So just like in World War II, when this tragic, struck, the NFL again, not only responded the way they did, but there were some players, who gave up their playing careers at the time to go fight for their country. And one of the most notable that we know is this man right here, Mr. Pat Tillman. And I know everybody has heard this story on what Pat Tillman means to the game of football and how his legacy played a huge role in what he stood for and what he did, to fight for his country. And, one of the great things about us here at the Hall of Fame is we have the opportunity to not only receive all these great artifacts from our Hall of Famers, but we receive artifacts from guys like Pat Tillman or guys who are currently playing in the league. And we're lucky enough to have one of those on display right now. So we're going to send things out back to the museum to Nathan Martin, who's in front of one of our artifacts from Mr. Pat Tillman.
Thanks, Jake. And as you guys can see, right now I've moved places. I'm in the first floor of our rotunda that documents the first century of pro football, standing next to what I believe is one of our coolest artifacts we have, Mr. Pat Tillman's jersey from the Arizona Cardinals. Pat Tillman was a 7th round draft pick of the Arizona Cardinals out of Arizona State University and eventually became the team's starting safety. He put his career on hold to go serve for his country in 2002, becoming a member of the U.S. Army in the elite Army Ranger unit. Tillman tragically lost his life while serving in Afghanistan in 2004. His sacrifice is something that we as football fans and Americans won't soon forget. Back to you, Jake.
So to follow that up is, what does somebody like Pat Tillman mean to the NFL as a whole and to the game of football, and why should we continue to honor someone like him and his legacy?
Well, the thing that there's so many ways in which Pat represents not just football, but he represents Americans. And when Pat made the decision, and we have him on videotape talking about it, made the decision to give up his pro football career, which, as we all know, is a lucrative career, to go and serve for his country. He's saying, he felt frustrated after 9/11. His father and his grandfather and his uncles had served, and he said, I felt like I wasn't doing enough. What can I do? And he said, I felt that I had to do this. And that, that's kind of what Americans are really about. We're always looking, if maybe not to serve in the military, but how can we help in times of need? And he epitomized the ultimate sacrifice, not only by giving up his livelihood, he gave up his life for his country. And there's no higher calling for any individual, for somebody to fight for what they believe in and pay that ultimate sacrifice. So he represents so many good things that, you can look at Pat Tillman and you can say, this is a guy who did it for all the right reasons. And that's what we all try to do, is do it for the right reasons.
So I know that was a lot of information very quick, but that's all the time we have today. I know every time Joe and we talk, I learned something. I learned some stuff today again. I hope everybody tuning in on Facebook learned something as well. So I want to thank everybody for tuning in today. If you want more great stuff like this, we're going to be here on Facebook every week at 12 p.m. Eastern time, bringing you different topics like this. Next week, make sure you tune in. We're going to talk about how art is related to the game of football and the Pro Football Hall of Fame. And if you want more stuff from the Pro Football Hall of Fame, make sure you subscribe, like, follow all of our social media channels, and stay up to date with all the things we have going on here at the Pro Football Hall of Fame. So for myself, Nathan Martin, Jerry Shockey, and Mr. Joe Horrigan, we'd like to thank you for tuning in, and have a great weekend. Have a great 4th of July weekend. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.